from just outside the Empire City at the crossroads to the northeast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, this is your premier podcast for all things unknown, not media, and I'm your host, JP. Welcome to Not Media. I'm your host, JP. Today, for our 13th episode, I have a very special guest. Frank Morano is from Staten Island and is currently the host of WABC's radio, The Other Side of Midnight. Frank delves into exploring the mysteries of the world, ranging from assassination conspiracy theories to UFOs. He's a longtime observer of the criminal justice system, hosts a podcast focused on organized crime called The Racket Report, and spends much of his time analyzing some of the most controversial cases in news in a way that's easy for people to understand. In addition to his work on radio, Frank is one of New York's leading activists in electoral reform and independent politics, an articulate advocate for reform on issues such as nonpartisan elections and term limits. Frank has been featured on NY1, C-SPAN, WEVD, WCBS, and countless other news and radio outlets. Past duties of his have also included working as a videographer for the Brooklyn Cyclones, which was an interesting fact. In addition to being an advocate for youth participation in politics, in March 2005, this is a fun fact, he set a world record by hosting a 33-hour live TV show talk marathon, which is interesting. Frank previously served as a producer for some of the biggest names in radio, such as the Kurbis and Kubi Show on WABC Radio, and he's also been on Newsmax's Liquid Lunch as a contributor. I noticed that he was also one of the producers of a documentary called Get Me Roger Stone, which I was able to power watch within this past couple days after I found out about that, and I thought it was great. He has a fondness for cheese, Star Trek, the New York Mets, and all things related to Atlantic City. Welcome to Not Media, Frank.
JP,
how are you this afternoon?
Great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. That's quite a comprehensive introduction. I may have to hire you to write my eulogy.
Yeah, so speaking of, it sounds like that you like things related to Atlantic City. Today, for our 13th episode, it happens to be on the 13th. So, and I have other numbers, and I've kind of been, and I realized after my obsession with the number 3 and multiples of 3 that Nikola Tesla was also obsessed with 3s and multiples of 3s, but I consider 13 a lucky number.
You're kidding.
So,
yeah,
I appreciate you.
I didn't realize that about Tesla, but it's one of the many things that you guys have in common. Did you see the Jim Carrey movie, The Number 23?
I did not actually.
It was a film that the critics didn't love, but given your fondness for one particular number and the fact that you're aware of Tesla and others having that fondness for certain numbers, I think you would get a lot out of it. I thought it was really interesting, but the central plot point is someone's obsession with the number 23. It's sort of a mystery. I think it's worth checking out if you're interested in numerology.
Very cool. Yeah. Very cool. I will certainly look that one up because I am a fan of Jim Carrey. I thought his I watched all those Netflix documentaries how he portrayed Andy Kaufman, and they actually did a documentary on him portraying Andy Kaufman. Kaufman, because he like immersed himself so much in the character that it was almost like staggering to a lot of people. They're like, do not call him Jim. Like if you go to set, you're going to get him upset. So
I saw that documentary.
Yeah,
I think it's called When Jim Met Andy, and I thought it was really well done. I'm a big fan of that film where he played Andy Kaufman, Man on the Moon. But I mean, watching that documentary, you're right. He definitely took character immersion to a whole new level.
Excellent. Yeah. So, with you having a fondness for Atlantic City, do you have any? Because I know this is common. It would be considered like more mystical compared to science, but a lot of people in sports and a lot of people who just are in high places in life tend to be somewhat superstitious. Like you could take, for example, like blowing on dice, a superstition, and because you're someone who partakes in activities such as visiting Atlantic City and doing some gambling. Is that anything that you've ever done, or blowing on dice or anything like that?
I was just playing dice with my son. I think I have some dice now. He probably took them. I usually have some dice near here, but But yeah, I mean, I don't know of a gambler, especially I like to play craps. I don't know of a craps player that's not at least somewhat superstitious, right? So
Yes.
I don't do much of the blowing on dice kind of a thing, but for instance, once the I don't know how familiar you are with craps or the audience, but once the mark or the point is established, seven basically ends your turn. So I would never ever in 1,000 years say the number seven at a craps table,
Okay.
especially once the point is established. Because so that's
Got it.
superstition, but there's a bunch of others.
Okay, cool. All right, so I see you grew up in Staten Island. Would you say growing up in one of the boroughs of New York City shaped your political views, giving you some sort of an impetus for getting you involved in politics, or any of the things that you've gotten involved with as far as either like politics or radio, um, you know, throughout the years, and you're taking to independent politics from what I read about you.
Well, it's a good question. I guess in any area of life, our interests, our profession, our hobbies, they're a byproduct, at least to some extent, of our upbringing, right? So I couldn't really say how much growing up in New York has shaped my chosen profession or my interest in certain things, but I would think it has to, right? I mean, New York is, I think, the most interesting place in the world. And part of the reason it is so interesting is because of the media markets here, because of the colorful personalities that have been on talk radio and in the local media here, and because of the political environment here. So I really couldn't say if I grew up in Sheboygan how different I would be as a person, but I imagine it would
Yeah,
be somewhat pretty different. So I don't know. We're all a product of where we come from, and I think
yeah.
very much a product of New York. But I couldn't necessarily tell you how much it's played a role in me doing this or me doing that.
Okay. Yeah. I definitely understand. I could see just from listening to your show sometimes that you have a wide range of interests, and you could say that maybe being like a metropolitan in some way, shape, or form shaped that. Just being exposed to so many different things. So I could
Yeah,
see
I would
that.
think so. I would think so.
Um, and I see that you have a bachelor's degree from NYU. Was that a BA in media and communication studies, or
So
uh, no?
the school at NYU that I went to it was called and remains called Gallatin. And what you can do at Gallatin is really interesting. If you're like me and you have a lot of diverse interests, is you can kind of create your own curriculum. So what your degree is in, your major is in something called individualized study. So my bachelor's degree from Gallatin is in individualized study.
Oh, very nice. At what point in your life did you decide that you wanted to pursue a media or radio career?
It's tough to say because I was always such a fan of radio and talk radio specifically as a medium
Yeah,
for entertainment and information. I guess the first moment a moment that was very much an awakening for me was when I was in the fourth or fifth grade, and I would carry a transistor radio with me to school all the time so I could listen to the baseball games and things like that. But everyone had been talking about this guy, Rush Limbaugh. And I never really
yes.
heard him. And I said, all right, let me listen to him in the back of the classroom for a bit and see what all the fuss is about. And I'm listening to him, and he's, it sounded just to me like your standard, news broadcast, nothing special. And then he was talking about the G7 summit in Humpsback, Nova Scotia, and that's how he said it. And when he said Humpsback, Nova Scotia, he absolutely blew my mind because before that moment, I never realized that you could be funny talking about serious things. I never realized that you could make serious points while satirizing
Yeah,
places like the names of places. So when he said Nova Scotia instead of Nova Scotia, that my mind was blown, and that's I think the moment
yeah,
when I first realized that maybe this was something that you could do as a career. But I really couldn't tell you when I, made the transition from being an enthusiastic fan of talk radio to wanting to pursue it as a career. But at some point, it happened.
Okay. And that's yeah. I know. I read Rush not still doing radio? I thought I read somewhere recently. Did Rush Limbaugh
He
pass
did. He
away?
passed
When did
away,
he
I
pass?
think, about 40 years ago.
That's
Right,
sad news. Yeah, I know how much of
maybe
an
3 years.
influence he had. I remember my father was big into Rush when I was
Mhm.
young. I used to always hear him on in the radio in the background somewhere. I never got too much into it, but I just remember the name coming up, quite a bit. And so, as far as your interest in politics, is that something that your family supported, or did you meet somebody in like a school program that like shifted you towards? Because I know I read when you were younger, you got involved in independent politics or supporting independent
Yeah,
politics.
I
For
don't really think I ever met anyone that pushed me in one direction or another. It was just something I was always interested
Okay,
in. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Last Hurrah, but it's a great film. Spencer Tracy and Jeffrey Hunter. As a child, I was always very interested in sports, and in that film, Jeffrey Hunter is a sports writer, and his uncle is the mayor of Boston, based on a real life mayor, Mayor Curley, I think. But
okay.
the mayor character, played by Spencer Tracy, he says to the Jeffrey Hunter character, he says, "Do you know what the the biggest sport in America is?" And Jeffrey Hunter basically makes a guess based on what he knows about paid attendance and things like that. He says, "No, that's all wrong. The biggest spectator sport in America is politics." And I think that's exactly right. I think so much of my interest in sports, especially professional wrestling, as a child, it's really, you see so many parallels to the world of politics, the larger than life personalities, the way the chessboard operates, the fact that nothing is ever like the day before it, but in many respects everything is like the history that has preceded it. And then you think you could actually affect the outcome as a participant, which is something that you really can't do in pro wrestling, is really something. So I think, just as a young person, my interest in sports was naturally lent itself to an interest in politics. And then, as far as independent politics goes, I've always been a little bit of a rebel, and always attracted to third parties and minor parties, and people that are again anti-establishment. But I was always such a big pro wrestling fan, especially of Jesse Ventura. And when he ran
Yes.
for governor in 1998 of Minnesota, that is one of the things that really inspired me to become more devoted to the cause of independent politics. And I would say, if I had to pick an inspiration for focusing specifically on the world of independent politics, it would be Jesse Ventura and his run for governor in 1998.
Yeah, his career. I don't know a whole lot about Jesse Ventura, but it's very impressive. It almost sounds like um, in like a way, shape, or form that the fact that you had someone from entertainment, it almost seems like similar to what Schwarzenegger did with becoming the governor of California. And I just think it's really interesting. He had such like a diverse career, from going to professional wrestling to being a serious politician, being the governor of a state, and then he would hosted that show. Was it Conspiracy
Right.
Theory? And that was very cool. And I think he explored all sorts of different aspects of the unknown. So the fact he was able to kind of juggle all those together and be taken serious in all of those arenas is very impressive. Because obviously somebody, you follow a lot of people in entertainment and just know a lot about what's going on in the world. You kind of see, it doesn't always, the transition always doesn't, switch over from one thing to another. Like, you'll have
Right.
somebody, like a Will Smith, for example, is not everybody. He is the exception to the rule and the superstar. The fact that he went from being first known in music and he switched over and became somebody who was very well respected to a class A actor and acting.
Yeah, well,
So it's not.
thankfully for Chris Rock and any other award presenters, Will Smith is a rarity. We don't generally see folks slapping others, but yeah, you're so right about the
Yeah.
comparison with Jesse Ventura and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Schwarzenegger. And, Ventura as an actor was in 3 Arnold Schwarzenegger films, Predator, Batman and The
Yes.
Running Man. And, they were friendly. And Jesse Ventura believes, I'm not sure if Schwarzenegger would agree with this, but Ventura believes that him running for governor in 98, that actually inspired Schwarzenegger to then run for governor 5 years later, because he had seen
Oh, very
the
cool.
success that Ventura had from the world of entertainment transitioning into the world of politics.
Yeah, that's great, and that's why I think at some level, I've thought about this before. At some point in my life, I work a full time career in law enforcement now, but sometime in my life before that, I was actually pushing for a career in entertainment, and I played it in a rock band.
Oh, really?
Was very very serious
Oh,
about
that's
it,
great.
and yeah, and I know that it's just that I think about it sometimes, and I think about like I would scratch my head and be like, all the thousands and thousands of like let's say people playing in bands.
Mhm.
If you look on the underground level, there's tens of thousands of people playing in bands, all with that similar dream, but very few people get to live it.
Right.
And it's almost like the people that do like for example, in my life, I was playing at the same clubs that Lady Gaga was
Wow.
playing at right around the time she was coming up, like 2007, 2008. Some of the clubs that I did shows at, like it just maybe that we didn't play together was by chance, but I saw pictures of on her Wikipedia of her. I was like, whoa, we used to play
Oh,
that
that's
club,
great
and
fun.
that was the same area we used to play. So like by happenstance, we could have actually played with her, but like the people that actually make it almost stand as a testament to what's possible for humanity, and they give us inspiration to give us confidence maybe that we wouldn't have otherwise
That's
had if
very
it wasn't
interesting.
for.
So, but for a few rolls of the dice going the other way, you could have been Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga. You've been Lady JP.
That's true. Never thought about that. So, just real quickly, tell me a little bit about this world record. That was an interesting fun fact that I found about you. 2005, 33-hour talk show marathon. Was that the longest someone ever did a talk show
At,
marathon, or like what
the
was the world
time,
record for?
it was the record. And now that record's been broken many times over. I think it's something crazy now. When last I looked, it was something like 78 hours, more than double what I had
Oh
done. But
wow.
at the time that I had
Yeah.
broken it, the record was 30 hours. And yeah, as you point out, I was doing a public access television show at the time called Morano Vision, and at that time the record was 30 hours, and we did 33, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and
Yeah.
I'd love to do something like that again. But trying to find, and as a busy guy that's trying to balance a lot of things yourself, I know that you can appreciate this. Trying to find 33 straight hours to do anything is a
Yes.
challenge.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know that it's definitely hard when you're trying to juggle a bunch of
Yeah.
different things, especially like I said, I know you have a family and just everything else you have going on with your career. It's a good goal to have, but maybe something for yourself to be on the back burner until maybe
We'll
free
see.
up some time. But you have to pat yourself on the back. You did set the bar
Well,
for somebody
thank
else
you.
to break
It
your
was a
record.
lot of fun,
So,
though.
so somebody at one
It was a lot of fun.
yeah, somebody looked to yeah. At some point, somebody was looking to you and saying, Frank Morano, he's the bar, and he's the person that I look up to. That's how I have to, beat 33 hours. And as a follow up, when did your interest, because this podcast, the theme of my podcast was that I've always had an interest in the
Mhm.
unknown, and just throwing that back to you, and for me, this goes far. I think I mentioned in my first episode, in the 6th grade, and I never really thought about it. I actually did a book report. We had a chance in like an English class to pick a subject, and I actually picked the Loch Ness
Right.
monster. Because I remember everybody was talking about the Loch Ness monster, I'm like, I know nothing about the Loch Ness monster. Is this even like something that's possible? So like I've always kind of had an interest in like things that like kind of make most people just be like either like that's kind of weird, or like most people won't go near it just because there's kind of like stigmas around it. But I've always like that's where what I've been drawn to. So for my podcast, like that's the theme of like my overall podcast. Like every episode, I try to pick something that kind of makes somebody either be like they're like scared to look into it because there's just so much controversy about it, or it just makes most people just scratch their head and they're just clueless. But for yourself, I noticed on your radio show you do a lot of unknown topics. When did that a quest, or when did that interest start for you? Was there was a defining moment? And I know Jesse Ventura, you had mentioned he was into that show.
Mhm.
produced a conspiracy theory. But for you, was there
Well,
some
yeah,
sort of
I caught
impetus?
your that first episode where you mentioned that. I thought that was a lot of fun that you had done that book report on the Loch Ness monster that early in your scholastic career. And I was trying to remember if I ever did anything similar, and I don't think I did. I do remember taking out books on the Loch Ness monster from the library, but I don't think I ever actually went so far as to do a book report on it. So good for you that you did that. It's so interesting, and I guess I never really thought about it before, but I think probably the my interest in the paranormal, the mysterious, the occult to some extent, the things that are a little wacky. It probably began when I was a child, and I would go with my mother to the grocery store, and she would go shopping, and I would sit and read all of the wacky supermarket tabloids. So you had the Weekly World News, you had the Sun, you had two or three others, that would have, on their front page, aliens meeting with the president or things of that nature. And, that's the first time I really learned as a 6, 7, 8, 9 year old what these things are. It's the first time I guess I had really heard of Bigfoot and the Loch Ness monster and these stories about aliens. And while a lot of what's in those tabloids is, I think maybe all of what's in those tabloids is just totally fictitious, it did inspire me to want to learn more about all those other areas. And then being a fan of radio, I would get into listening to radio late at night, and I would hear a lot of radio shows focused on material like this. Obviously, nobody did it more and better than Art Bell. I was a big fan of Art Bell on the radio, and also Alan Colmes to some extent when he was doing evenings on the radio. He would deal with the metaphysical and the things that are a little outlandish from time to time. I think there's just something, I am interested in it, but I think there's just something about the nature of late night radio, which leads itself to exploring mysteries, whatever those mysteries are, whether
Yes.
they involve aliens or, the Loch Ness monster or Bigfoot or anything like that. I think, people are so, I do talk about politics from time to time, but people are so exhausted by the time 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. rolls around with political discussions that I think they're just ready for something a little bit different and a little bit more offbeat. So that's what I try and give them.
Very cool, and I never that was some very good insight to why, because I mean personally, I got a chance to meet George Norrie back in to actually at my last episode. It was about the question that I asked him because I stood up in the room, asked him, and then I got to shake his hand at the end. It was in 2008, and I asked him about the it was my episode, I think it was episode 11 on Not Media, and I don't want to get too much into it, but it was something about the California drones. And I actually asked George Norrie because that's originally where I heard
Uh-huh.
about them. It was Coast to Coast AM, but I never thought about that. And that's some very good insight to say that, like, and I get it. And there's only so much, because I used to watch a lot of news, and then it was like the same
Right.
thing over and over and over, and negative and negative. And like and when some people would start telling me about it, I'm like, wow, I'm like, you can't spend too much time, because a lot of this mainstream news is doom and gloom. And like if you feed into that, you almost become just a number for them, just a stat, if you're constantly kind of like tapping into that and getting all worked up about it. So I was like, I have to get my dose, just so I can be informed what's going on with work and
Right.
everything. But past that, like you said, it's a relief to be able to kick back, and it's a relief to have you actually, when you're on and you're talking about stuff like this, because I'm out there doing, police work, responding to medical calls and domestic calls, and I'm out there. I work midnight, so a lot of times I switch on between coast to coast. I switch on to your program live, and I'll listen to a podcast. I flip between different
Sure.
sources of media, but I appreciate being able to kind of kick back and unwind and have somewhere else to go where like my mind could cut loose and I could explore some other greater mysteries. It's kind of like where I get my kicks, and I think a lot of people can agree with that. A lot of people. That's why shows like Coast to Coast AM are so popular, and so many millions of people across the country enjoy listening to
Yeah,
them.
no, I would agree with you.
Moving
Thank you.
Switching over to your interest in organized crime. Um, I hear on your podcast, and I was actually able to power listen. And I say power listen when I mean I'll put on like a podcast and I speed up the
Got it.
speed maybe to like
Sure.
2.5. And while I was on patrol like all week at home and like any spare minute I can get, I listened to, I believe you have 29 episodes. I listened to all 29
Wow.
episodes of your
I'm
podcast.
impressed.
And, so I was like, but like
You
I
should
said,
get an
I
award or
I
something.
speeded it up quite a bit.
Sure.
Yeah, I speeded up quite a bit so I could kind of try to take it in as much as I could without, I just wanted to see if there was anything cool that you went over that I could bring up since I knew I had the interview scheduled with you. I heard in your podcast you attended John Gotti's trial. Was this the trial? Was this the trial in relation to? I'm not 100% sure. I know I watched the Netflix series Get Gotti, and it was you know, in relation to either his crimes within organized crime, and I think some of that had to do with the incident with Curtis Lewa, if that were two separate trials, or so. What was the nature of that? Was that your beginning or your impetus for switching over to an interest in organized crime, or did you already have an interest and this was just an opportunity for you?
So I didn't see Get Gotti or Getting Gotti on Netflix. I had asked people who were who were better versed than me on this, if it was worth seeing, and basically I had heard that it wasn't. That it was basically the same story that has been told 100 times
Okay.
with different rats, essentially in that
Yeah.
role. If people are interested in seeing a documentary that I think is really honest and fairly objective, there's one that's on A&E, and they play it all the time. And if people can watch it on demand, I'm sure it's called Gotti, Godfather and Son. It was directed by Richard Stratton, who is very knowledgeable and a bright guy. And I'm actually one of the people featured in that documentary. Very, very small part. It's a miniseries, but it has nothing to do with my recommendation. It's really good, and it's not a love letter to the Gottis at all. It's pretty objective. There's FBI agents in it. There's informants in it. It's a very objective miniseries, so I recommend that. It's called Gotti, Godfather and Son. But just to be clear, so I covered the 4 trials of John Gotti Jr. I didn't cover any of
Okay.
the trials
Okay.
of the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, John Gotti in the early 90s. But in those 4 trials of John Gotti Jr., there's a lot of crossover, a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same witnesses, some of the same FBI agents that were involved in that prosecution as were involved in the prosecution of John Gotti the Elder in the early 1990s. But yeah, I would say that experience was really transformative for me for a few reasons. Prior to that, and that first trial, he was indicted, I think, in 2004, and the trial began about a
Okay.
year later. Prior to that, I was always kind of the impression, like I think a lot of people are growing up, that if the cops arrested you and you were indicted, chances are you were probably guilty, right? Looking at that trial, watching that trial, and seeing how much the government, to be honest, cheats, and seeing how prosecutors and FBI agents cut corners and do whatever it takes to win was really such an eye-opening experience for me. Because, and I'll never forget, during that trial, John's lawyer. So what had happened? I won't make this all about that because I know there's probably other subjects that you want to get to. But I'll just mention this because I think it's illustrative of what the Department of Justice does and what prosecutors do. So John Gotti Jr. Was secretly recorded while he was at Raybrook Prison, and there was recording after recording, including conversations of him with his attorney, Richard Raybach, which is just amazing to me
Oh,
that they were able to get
client
anybody
attorney.
to sign
Yeah.
off on secretly recording a
Yeah.
client talking with his attorney, but they did it. So in these conversations, they record these conversations, and repeatedly in these conversations, John Gotti Jr. basically says, I'm done with the mob. I don't want anything to do with it. I, want nothing to do with that life. And he's saying all sorts of things that were bolstering his defense. His defense in that case wasn't that he wasn't in the mob. It was that he was in the mob, but had withdrawn from it prior, 5 years prior to the indictment or more. And these are all things that he's saying while he's being secretly recorded that are bolstering his defense and would strengthen his defense. So the prosecutors actually tried to not allow any of that into evidence, which to me was amazing. They secretly record the guy for hours and
Oh,
hours and hours, and then
yeah,
because he's
yeah,
saying things that are exculpatory, they're trying to get that excluded. And so we go to break, like for lunch or something, and John's lawyer says to me, as he says, "Did you see that?" He said, "These guys are just as dishonest as we are." And I found that to be true. I found that the Justice Department and prosecutors in general, especially at the federal level, they're all too
yeah,
willing to cheat in order to get a conviction or to get whatever they perceive to be as a win. And I think that's really wrong
yeah,
because not only are we paying for these prosecutions, but they're being done in our name. It says
yes,
United States versus John A. Gotti. It doesn't say, XYZ prosecutor versus John A. Gotti. These prosecutions are being done in our name. And I really think, at the very least, we as taxpayers and the public should demand that they're done fairly and with a respect for the Constitution. And I fear that too often
yes,
they're not. So I covered those four trials. And when you kind of learn about all the characters involved, the lawyers, the gangsters, and you develop sources and you get an interest in a lot of these cases, you end up following other cases that are kind of related. And then I ended up covering a whole bunch of other trials. The trial was of Vinnie Gorgeous Basciano, Tommy Gioli. That was a very interesting trial to cover.
yeah,
John Burke, Joe Waverly, Joel Cacase, Bobby Glasses Vernacci, and a number of others. But those four trials of John Gotti Jr. were certainly really interesting, and I would say that was the beginning of my interest in exploring the
great.
world of organized
A-
crime.
And and at the time was for you, was that a paid gig? You were working as a reporter for.
Well, yes and no. So I was working at the time as the producer of the Curtis and Kubi show, at which I was
Okay,
getting paid for. But then I would go to court after producing the radio show and sit in court all day
okay,
and take notes. And
yeah,
then this is at least the first trial, and then I had different roles in the other three trials because this was over 4 years. But I really wasn't paid anything extra for that. No.
okay. So this was you doing your due diligence, working for their extra. This
Yeah,
you
I
were
would
putting in
I would
extra
say
work,
so.
and that
Yeah.
led you kind of doing your homework outside led to start to build a fascination. And I certainly um, can take your points into consideration for I don't know what the term they say, like what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Like I don't know if it, it's like if you're going to have one thing one way for, let's say, somebody who you're considering a suspect. What if somebody who you consider innocent being accused of something? So you have to be like, I know this is a term that's probably used a lot, fair and balanced, as far as not necessarily politically, but just as far as um, the same rules
Right.
apply. The same rules
Right.
apply. So we can't sit here and cherry pick. And I think that was a good point that you brought up, and it maybe showed some errors in our criminal justice system, that if you're going to secretly record, and I don't know under what terms, if it was because it was a prison or a jail, if they were able to bypass. But I know there are certain laws, and I work on the backside of law enforcement, where I'm the actual guy that actually might arrest
Mhm.
somebody for doing a crime. So I'm not 100% sure, even though I have a degree in criminal justice, what the on the as far as the prosecution side and the judicial side. What the laws are, if it's that. I know there's attorney client privileges, and I know what a client says to their attorney is confidential. So oftentimes, like, I've watched cases about murder and
Mhm.
cases about like some serious crimes, and they're like, the attorney's like, well, just tell me everything. I'm like, you could tell me. I'm not necessarily going to go and tell anybody. I
Right.
can't. So if you tell me, hey, I actually did it, and, I actually killed a person or something like that, they actually get, you speak that with your attorney, say, hey, I'm actually guilty. Here's
Mhm.
what happened. But, like, how can you protect me because I thought it was in self defense or something like
Sure.
that, and I don't want to like say too much and make myself look bad. So there's all sorts of colors and shades and
Mhm.
different aspects of law enforcement, but we have to be fair because at the end of the day, some people might say, hey, we're going after someone who's bad. But what if they're going after someone who some people consider
Well,
good? And then all
and
of a sudden
again,
it's like, well, you could pick and choose what you want to submit or not submit. Like, no, if you record it, it should be present, for everybody, for defense and
right.
prosecution,
So,
right?
yeah, absolutely. But that is just one example, right? That's just one example
Yeah.
randomly. But I could give you a dozen other examples of the Department of Justice and the prosecutors, not just in those cases, but in other cases, totally cheating, totally manipulating the system, and trying to put their thumb
Yeah.
on the scale. But when you use those terms, good and bad, to me, it makes no difference. I don't care if someone is a saint or if they're the most evil person in the world. I want everybody, including bad
Yeah.
guys, to have the
Yes.
same kind of constitutional liberties that I have. Because the reason the Bill of Rights
Yes.
exists, almost everything in there is basically a constraint on an oppressive government. And once we start doing things to people that are bad guys and taking away their constitutional liberties, eventually all our constitutional liberties are gone. So, for instance,
Yes.
talking
Yes.
about John Gotti the Elder, who died, 23 years ago. Uh, in that third trial that he was on, or maybe it was the fourth trial, depends on how you count. John, Jay Gotti, John the Elder, they wouldn't even let him use his own attorney in that trial. And they came up with some
Yeah.
nonsense reason to deny him his choice of counsel. Now, once we start denying gangsters the lawyer of their choice, we're that much
Yeah.
closer to nobody getting the lawyer of their choice. So even though, John
Yes.
Gotti was a gangster, he was a criminal, a murderer, bad guy by every stretch of the imagination, he should have, even though he's a bad guy, the same constitutional rights that everybody else has. But I think,
Yes.
unfortunately, we're way too willing to say because somebody's a bad guy, we don't care too much if their constitutional liberties are trampled upon.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is a slippery slope, and I could certainly agree with you. Even somebody who, right now, the way I pay my bills is part of my responsibilities is catching
Well,
bad
that's
guys.
great,
But I
and
would
that's
certainly
and that's
see
great.
your points there.
And that's great, and I'm appreciative that there are people like you keeping us all safe. And don't misunderstand me. I don't want criminals roaming free, but I also don't
I
want
understand.
the Bill of Rights
Yeah,
to be put through a shredder.
because once you start violating rights, it goes across the board. You or I could be next in the
Right. You
crosshairs.
mentioned Roger Stone
So
before. I think when he was arrested for, a case that I think was almost totally nonsensical, but it was certainly nonviolent. When the FBI arrested him in the middle of the morning, 5:30, the wee hours of the morning, whatever it was, they went and arrested him, in a pre-dawn raid as if he was El Chapo. Now, Roger Stone never
yeah,
he's never owned a weapon. None of the crimes that he was
yeah,
charged with were violent, and they
yeah,
were really
yeah, yeah,
almost technical crimes, if at all. And yet
yeah,
the
yeah,
overreaction by the FBI
yeah,
and the prosecutors in that case, to me, it tells you all you need to know, which is for a lot of these folks, especially if you have a high profile defendant, whether it's Roger
yeah,
Stone or John A. Gotti, it's all about publicity, promotion, meaning for prosecutors, and politics. Because there are so many of these
yeah,
prosecutors, and including people that I like Rudy Giuliani, but there's so many of these prosecutors that use high profile prosecutions as a means to run for public office. Rudy Giuliani, William
yeah,
Weld, Chris Christie, Elliot Spitzer, countless others. So you really just wonder what value is it to the public of having these
yes,
FBI style, these FBI raids reminiscent of El Chapo taking down Roger Stone, when they could have just called
yeah,
Roger's attorney and said, he's under arrest. Can you please have him
Yeah,
to come in
turn
today.
himself in.
I mean, it's just
Yeah,
what why do that? Why put someone
low
through the
risk.
indignity of that and
Yeah,
their family through that, all at taxpayer
yeah.
expense? To me, it's absurd, quite honestly.
It's more like a show of power.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah, it more becomes a spectacle and a show of power for the public than it is more for like, come on, like this is
Sure.
not somebody who had any violent crimes. This is not somebody who's at risk of doing something violent during
Right.
apprehension. More likely than not, if we just said, "Hey, we have a warrant, contact the
Exactly.
attorney. Could you please
Right.
turn yourself in? At least give you the opportunity to do so,
Exactly.
so we don't have to go over the top and uh, do anything brash,
Sure.
and have anything bad happen during something like that. Lastly, before we switch gears to JFK, which is what I want to
Mhm.
talk to you about, because I know you have a fascination about that. The last thing I was going to ask you is, have you heard? I don't want to spend much time on this. This is more for just like a interesting story. Have you ever read or done any research or read anything about Glenn Carmichael and his invention of the monkey paw, the light wand, and the tongue? Have you ever heard anything
No,
about
I'm
this man?
fascinated though. It sounds like this might be a good future
So,
radio topic.
this is actually very interesting. You know how they like talk about people in terms of like when they say somebody who contributed something really bad to
Right.
humanity, they'll say, "Wow, like that person was really evil." Imagine if they switched it around and did something good, like the things they could have done for
Right.
humanity as opposed to doing bad. Like this is definitely one of those type of guys. Um, Apparently he was some sort of like a re- repairman. I forget what it was, if it was like TV or refrigerator, but he was a repairman of some kind. And he, came across some financial trouble, and he was so ingenious as far as like the way he thought and his understanding of engineering. He started making items that would be able to trick slot
You
machines.
kidding? Wow.
And every time and then he would sell them on the black market. Like the
Oh,
first item that he made was called the monkey paw. It was a very simple tool. I think it was something that was inserted in the machine. It tricked the machine out from doing their cash outs. However, the machine was alerted to do cash outs. You'd be able to insert this monkey paw. It looked almost just like a fork on the end
mhm.
of like a piece of metal on a fork. So then the just like I said, the short of it is that every time the gaming industry would step their game up and come out with some new sort of technology that would like make, like they say, the monkey paw obsolete, he would come up with something
Wow.
newer and something more ingenious. And it got to the point where at the end he even had something called the tongue, which was like a microchip. You'd insert it in, and it would bypass somehow like the lighting. And then when they said, "Oh, these machines like they're like the little thing that pays the coins out when the light when the device triggers the light, it does it in a pattern. So once the machine catches the pattern, the machine will automatically do a cut. So these machines were getting smarter in order to combat the black market this guy was creating and selling these devices. They're devices you could make for like
Wow.
$10, but he was selling some of these things for like 20,000, 15,000, and selling them to people all across the country. And people were stealing money from casinos. So, like I said, since you don't really know
Yeah,
much
I'm going
about
to
it,
look
I
into
just want
this
to
now.
leave it
I'm
at that. But
fascinated.
it's something to look into. Yeah, there's been I'm sure you'll be able to
Yeah, I'm going to
find
look
at
into
least a
this.
few YouTube documentaries and TV shows. But yeah, the man's name was Glenn
Yeah, I'm
Carmichael,
making
and
myself a
that
note on that right now. I'm going to look into that. Is he still alive? It'd be certainly an interesting radio guest, I think.
he did some time. I think I forget what his time was. If he did 5 years in prison, and I think I believe. Believe it or not, I think when he got out, I think some of these casinos brought him back as a
Really, I'm not
consultant
surprised. All right, well,
because
I'm
he
going
was
to look
so
into him. I'll
good.
see if I can get in touch. That
Yeah,
sounds
yeah,
great.
like I said, okay, switching gears now. So finally, how long have you had an interest in JFK? And what's your overall quick take? And then we'll get into some
Mhm.
facts and ideas about what happened on that sad day in Dallas in 1963. I've heard you speak on your radio show about the document that are being withheld currently about
Mhm.
JFK, and in 2017, Trump had stated they were being withheld because they were damaging to national security. And like I said, we're going to look a little bit into that to see if we can come up with some concepts and ideas about what exactly happened there and why. But it's just as far as before we get into that, is there any sort of just general just take on that?
Well, so
What your take is?
I am like I am with most issues. I am totally open minded when it comes to the Kennedy assassination, but I've always been curious about it, and I've always had a lot of questions about it for multiple reasons. One, the fact that the majority of Americans have never bought the Warren Commission conclusions. And going back from 1963 to the present day, a majority have always said they're suspicious, and that's putting it mildly, of what they came up with. So the fact that the majority of the people, not that that means they're correct, but the fact that the majority of people differ from where the Warren Commission comes down, I always found fascinating. Then when I was an intern briefly at the Fox News channel, and 21 years ago, one of the first projects that I worked on there was, and again, worked on in not in any significant role or role that matters, basically, typing up transcripts and doing administrative work, was a special that Fox News had done for the 40th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination called JFK Case Not Closed. And I ended up watching hours and hours of interviews that they had done with all sorts of people involved in the assassination and the
Yeah,
investigation. And I really was fascinated at the conclusions that Cyril Wecht came up with, which, and he's, I think, one of the, and I've interviewed him, and I think he's a brilliant man. And, he's getting on in years, so I'm going to make a note to invite him on the program again. But he is one of the best known forensic pathologists in the world. And he basically has said this single bullet theory was total nonsense. And, he has much more pointed language to describe it than total nonsense. But I've always had a tough time buying the single bullet theory, and the recent revelations from Mr. Landis, the Secret Service agent that was involved in that these days, and this bullet that was discovered, I think raises even more questions about the single bullet theory. So I've spoken with people that have raised every possibility imaginable, including John F. Kennedy's nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I've heard people who've claimed that the mob was responsible, that the elements of the CIA were responsible, that it was Castro, that it was some entities within the Soviet Union, that it was an anti-communist entity. I have no idea who was responsible for the Kennedy assassination. But I do feel that the investigation was poorly handled. And by the way, I've had people on my program that support the theory that Oswald was the lone gunman. And I've even done debates for the anniversary. I did an hour-long debate of someone that supported the idea that Oswald was the lone gunman and someone that didn't. And I thought they both raised good points. And I think you could talk to either one of them and find them pretty convincing. But I
yeah,
find it really questionable that every president, Republican and Democrat, has still gone along with hiding thousands of documents relevant to the Kennedy assassination. Now, this is 60 years ago. Who are we protecting?
yeah,
For any
yeah,
president, whether it's Trump or Biden or anybody else, to claim that it's due to national security, if there's anything regarding what was going on in the 1960s that would be affecting national security today, I find that strains credibility, to be honest, and I think it's problematic for
yeah.
a whole host of reasons. So the fact that there's this
Okay.
continued bipartisan cover up to keep these unredacted documents from ever coming to light, I find incredibly suspicious.
Okay. Yes. Yes. I agree. That's certainly a good point. And, you know, I feel like, this being one of the topics, I remember even when Clinton came into office, he said, I'm going to look into two things. I'm going to look into Roswell, which I've covered on my podcast. I'm going to look into what happened with the President Kennedy assassination. And there's even at a presidential level, they even claim, at least publicly, that like, oh, there's just um, so many questions and so many loose ends. And theories out there. And this is actually the Warren Commission. This was actually the birth of the general use of the term conspiracy theory, because they wanted to downplay what was going on. And I think they kind of said, well, if you agree anything different than we do, then this is just some sort of wild
Mhm.
conspiracy theory. You have nothing to back up what you're saying. So this was kind of like this era was kind of the birth of where they started um, disparaging the term conspiracy theory and labeling people who wanted to question the final word about what was going on. So I was able to one of the documentaries that you had mentioned. I was able to watch the movie JFK, watch a Inconvenient Truth, and then the follow up to that documentary, which was in 2020. There was like new revelations. I was able to watch both those documentaries, and I was also able to read a very very good book. And that book, for me, painted a very clear picture of who may have been
Which book?
involved and why they were involved, and just I'm not sure if and I wouldn't claim to do this, that I'm going to be able to tell you like what the name
Mhm.
of, say, the person that everybody purports to be, like the man on the grassy knoll. I'm not going to be able to give you that, but I certainly am going to be able to give you, with the time we
Mhm.
have left. What do you have? Approximately what are you good for? Like, say, about 20 minutes
Yeah,
ish.
I mean, whatever you need, whatever you need.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to cover. So the thing is, I probably am more on the end of I take probably more notes than I should, but I took extensive notes. So I read the book, I listened to the audiobook of The Unspeakable Truth, and this is a book written, a very very good book. It's written by James W.
Mhm.
Douglas, and I think from my homework, what I did was I found, with the limited time that I had, because like I said, before knowing I was going to interview you, I've known about the JFK assassination. I've looked into it lightly and briefly, but because I knew I was going to be speaking with you, I wanted to be able to come up with some my own thoughts and
Great.
and
Right.
and and feelings on what happened. And in order to do that, I wanted to have as much as I
Sure.
could in front of me at
Right.
one point to say, all right, this lines up, this doesn't line up, this lines up, this. So
And by
so
the way, just let
effectively
me
with the
interject quickly, so the audience knows that book that you reference, "The Unspeakable Truth" by James W. Douglas. That book is the book. I have not read it, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. But that book is the book that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. claims is the closest to his theory about what happened, and he believes
okay.
that that's the most accurate book on the Kennedy assassination. But like I said, I haven't read it, so I'll look forward to hearing your take on it.
And and as you're about to see, with good reason, I think it paints, like I said, without going into like um, names and details of like who this person was or who that person was, or was the mob involved? Possibly was the CIA involved? More than likely, was some sort of intelligence agency involved? More than likely, but like as far as the key details of who some of these people were, they were well protected. And as you're going to see how well
Mhm.
protected they were based upon some of the witnesses that came forward. So just some of the quick backdrop information a lot of people don't know, about Kennedy. He was a war hero. And, at some point when a boat that he was on, or
Right, the
his,
PT 109.
yeah, the PT 109 was destroyed. He swam for a total of 4.5 miles on different swims in order to help save himself and, more importantly, the people he was serving with in the Navy at the time. I believe it was the Navy,
Right.
correct? So yeah. So and then when he started to get into politics, he actually had a disliking for military expenditure. He was actually making a shift more towards peace. There was a lot of talk and a lot of information that came out after. He was actually trying to figure out ways to break bread with Khrushchev, who was the president of the Soviet Union at the time, with Castro, with President Lumumba from the Congo, from President Sudarka. Sudarka, I believe that was the pronunciation. I have it. When I get to that point, I'll let you know. But the president of
Hmm.
Indonesia, people at the time were considered independent nations that sided more towards communism, and or at least sympathized with the Soviets. So they were a lot of these independent countries that were coming into their own were considered threats from the establishment, the Department of Defense, the military industrial complex, and the CIA, which was then basically doing a lot of the like legwork for intelligence and running operations, such as supporting coups in some of these countries. So it's like Kennedy started to side against that. Some of the examples were that he attempted to put in place a 350 $1 million defense budget as he was senator, so there would be less reliance on nuclear weapons. And then we have the Bay of Pigs, which was in April of 1961. 1,500 Cuban exiles were trained to go take over to overthrow Cuba. The big contention with the Bay of Pigs was that Kennedy felt afterwards the reason why Kennedy pulled out, and this was a good takeaway, and a lot of people don't know this. He was blamed for the capture and death of a lot of these exiles and members of the CIA. He was blamed for that because he took public responsibility. But the reason was because, as news analyst Daniel Shore stated, and many other people, these exiles did not have the capability to overthrow Cuba. It was too much of a task for 1,500 exiles. So effectively, what Kennedy felt was that the CIA baited him into saying, just give us your signature and we'll
Mm-hmm.
go with this. And then at the final hour, when the CIA dropped the news, which effectively they knew what was going to happen, these guys are not going to make it. They're not going to be able to accomplish this if you don't sign the next order and send the military in there. They've taken the beaches, and we need the United States military to back them up. And once the military gets in there, we're talking about a full war with Cuba, and then potentially this could be the beginning of potentially a full war with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union at the time was supporting Cuba. So Kennedy saw the writing on the wall for that, and he said, "No, no, 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 I'm not going with this. This is not. You guys effectively tricked me," and he was furious about that. So that's why he pulled out the
Mm-hmm.
support. He goes, "I'm not backing this invasion up, because the original deal here was that we train these exiles, we support these exiles, and they do the work. We're just supporting them. And now at the 11th hour, you're telling me that you want to drag me in and you want my signature to start a full war. You want U.S. troops to back these exiles." And that was one of his reasons that he had was so against the Bay of Pigs. And when he did actually not support them with the United States military, they were captured and or killed. And a lot of people were angry in the CIA, the Department of Defense. There was a lot of contention. And that's afterwards the famous quote. I don't know if you ever heard this, that Kennedy said he would splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter them into the winds. And that's what he said after. He was that angry at the
Wow.
CIA. So, and soon afterwards, he fired Director Dulles, Deputy Director Bissell, and Campbell, and reduced the CIA budget, or aimed to reduce the CIA budget
Wow.
20% by 1966. So, like I said, around the same time, he was starting to send letters privately with Castro and Khrushchev. He was trying to make peace. Um, and just as far as the mob angle, as far as who might have been involved, or if the CIA was involved, there was confirmation that the under the Eisenhower administration, that the CIA hired John Rosselli, Sam Giancana, and Santos Trafficante, offered them $150,000. They were going to poison him with pills, but they couldn't get close enough. So just know that the CIA, which was under the Truman administration, which effectively was given, even though they started off as an intelligence agency, they were given carte blanche to go and
Mm-hmm.
support military coups and overthrowing these other nations that were considered threats. That right before Kennedy, gangsters were given the go ahead by the CIA to support doing assassinations, and money was offered to gangsters. So let's not think that that's far off
Sure.
the table, as far as what, like what may have happened, and how Kennedy started maybe making enemies within the CIA by firing very higher ups, by pulling out the support with that the CIA did support, and that people were very angry from the
Mm-hmm.
inside out. And there was talk afterwards that, from circumstantial evidence, that people were speaking with other people stating that members of the CIA were very angry about Kennedy doing this, and they wanted some sort of justice for what had been done out there, and they felt he turned his back on them, and he supported communism, which was considered the big evil at the time, as opposed to supporting more like the intelligence agencies and the military industrial complex. So as far as as far as what we know, Lee Harvey Oswald is to most people an enigma if you don't look into what some of his background was. And he was actually working in the military, and he was doing intelligence involving in Japan. It was involving U-2 spy planes. So he had a high level clearance in the military. Um, he was the only Marine ever to defect during peacetime to the Soviet Union
Wow.
with no history of being a Marxist or a
Mm-hmm.
communist, which was very strange. So he basically defected at some point, in the years, I think it was like 59 or 60. It was a couple of years before, but he defected to the Soviet Union and he worked at a factory out there. A lot of people, just because of the extreme leniency he was given when he renounced his citizenship of the United States and pledged his allegiance to the Soviet Union, that he was let back in here so smoothly. And it was actually paid for by the United States government. This was um, not speculation that he was working as some type of a double agent. There was a list. Let's see what the list was. Um, People that looked into or handled um, Oswald once he came back to the United States. There was a man called the Baron. He was a Texas geologist named George Morenshield, and he's the one that eventually um, was given the go ahead by a man named Jay Moore to meet Oswald and basically almost become like a handler of his when he got back to the United States. Mohrenschildt was working for the CIA as a contractor, and in return for things that he would do for the CIA, he was given like surveyor contracts. I think was one was for oil. He was basically given that's why he was called the Baron, because he was given contracts to do surveying for the
Mm-hmm.
CIA, and in turn, him doing these oil contracts in other countries, he was making a lot of money. So that was kind of his relationship with the CIA. So he had some sort of a foundation, and the fact that this guy became Oswald's best
Wow.
friend almost like a mentor of his when he got back to the United States speaks worlds about what sort of circles Oswald was actually crossing. Um, and on happenstance, when Mohrenschildt actually said that he was going to give a revelation about how he befriended Oswald and how he got him to settle in Texas, he was found shot to death within 3 hours. Actually, he was going to give that revelation in 1977, and they considered his death a
Wow.
suicide. But it was very
Oh, okay.
suspicious that this man, the second he started publicly talking about how, yeah, like I was kind of a handler of Oswald, and the fact that they knew Mohrenschildt had ties to the CIA, I think was very suspicious. And the man who also had called Mohrenschildt, who was a investigator for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, was also found shot to death, and they said it was a suicide. And this was right around the same
Wow.
time. So the man that called Mohrenschildt and said, "Hey, would you like to talk about your dealing with Oswald and the CIA?" And Mohrenschildt said, "Yes, I'd like to talk." Both of these men, in the year of 1977, were
Wow.
found shot to death. So very suspicious. And like I said, when we're dealing with agencies that are going to be paying gangsters to give you a poison pill, it's like you just never know where it's going to
Mm-hmm.
come from. But the fact is that there were certainly attempts being made, and so just kind of moving forward, without getting too bogged down in any sort of uh, situation as far as like who handled him with, but there was a number of connections like this with Oswald and the CIA, and he was actually flagged. There was a list. I can give you the name of it in a second, but there was actually an internal investigation within the CIA, and Oswald's name came up on that list. And it was stated that only the people on the list were members of the CIA or contractors that were considered security threats. And Oswald's name came up on a list of CIA either employees or contractors, which were being reviewed internally, almost like in internal review board for the CIA. and they were saying like, who do we have to worry about being a risk or a threat? His name was on one of these lists for being involved or from being an employee from the CIA. Um, so Kennedy, even though maybe publicly there were some things he was doing that was making him look like he was against the communist, and at some level he was, but he also didn't want war. He was worried about the children of this world and how a nuclear war would
Mhm.
affect them. So he was through secret channels trying to make peace at this time. Meanwhile, Oswald looks like he's being handled in some way, shape, or form. Publicly, he's making himself look like a communist. He's making himself look like he sympathizes with Castro. He's making himself he look like he sympathizes, but privately, there's definitely reason to believe that he was like a double agent.
Uh-huh.
You know, he was somebody probably being paid by U.S. intelligence agencies to publicly make himself look like, hey, I'm a defector.
Right.
Look at me, I'm a defector. And then when you come back here, like that kind of gets you in with being able to cross with certain circles of people that, you know, like maybe considered a risk to this country. That's what the benefit of having a double agent
Mhm.
is. You know, publicly you are claimed to be KGB, and privately you're actually working for the
Right.
CIA. So, you know, and there was also something very interesting. A Guy Bannister, who was known to be working for the FBI, had an address in New Orleans at 544 Camp Street. When um, Oswald went to New Orleans and was on the street corner in the center of the intelligence community there, handing out leaflets saying, you know, "Viva Castro," you know, like pro Castro. He was doing this in a very flamboyant
Mhm.
way. He actually started a fight with some of the members of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, basically saying that, you know, I support you. And then once he got out on the street corner, he's like, no, I support Castro. And he was being very public about this, and to the point where he actually got into a fight and got arrested. And then they had him on a radio show after, because he was broadcasting to everybody that I support Castro, I support. And he was doing this very publicly. But very interesting that the same address that Guy Bannister had for an FBI office was listed on this leaflet as Oswald's address, 544 Camp Street. So somehow these guys were, you
Mhm.
know, would it be that somebody who works for the FBI would literally give out the same address as somebody who's pro Castro? And a lot of people were like, through private circles, they were like, "Hey, what's up with this Oswald guy? This guy's, you know, while he's outside our you know, these offices, he's chanting how he's pro." And a lot of people were like, "Calm down, calm down. He's one of us. Just you know, don't jump to
Right.
any assumptions about this man." So just kind of moving forward a little bit. Um, Kennedy then, moving into 63, signs National Security Memorandum 263. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with what that is, but he was getting pushed by the Joint Chief of Staffs, General Lemnitzer, um, and Operation Northwoods. They were proposing crazy ideas to him. They were like, we're going to fly a drone over Cuba and we're going to record fake voices. It's going to be empty, but we're going to. This was called Operation Northwoods. This was what was getting pushed to Kennedy behind
Right.
closed doors. So the generals were like, "We're going to fly an empty plane over Cuba. We're going to record voices of people screaming, saying, 'Oh my God, we've been hijacked. Help us!' We're going to blow the plane up, and we're going to use that as a premise to start a war with
Wow.
Cuba. We're going to create a false flag." And this is not conspiracy theory. This
Right.
is fact. Operation Northwoods, it was called. Kennedy was like, absolutely not. So he was fighting the Joint Chief of Staff, fighting the Department of Defense, the CIA, things that they were doing abroad, adamantly. And he signed NSAM, National Security Memorandum 263, which effectively stated by the end of 1963, I want 1,000 troops. And I think at the time there was about 16,500 troops in Vietnam. This is before it got ramped up towards the middle, the end of the 60s. I want 1,000 troops out by the end of 1963. By 1965, I want 100% of U.S. troops out of Vietnam. I will have nothing to do with that. I believe the French already tried to do something similar in the 1950s, and they were absolutely slaughtered. And him and his brother saw the writing
Mhm.
on the wall. This is an unwinnable war, and I won't subject our people. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff was even talking about, we have the capability of doing small scale nuclear attacks, and we'll definitely win this war. And he flipped out so bad he walked out of the office and he said, "You call yourselves the human race? when they started talking about numbers. They were like, well, some of the numbers are, projected to be maybe if we start the first attack on Indochina, and then we start a preemptive attack on the Soviets, say 40 million people. He stormed out of the office and he was like, I cannot believe you people call yourself the human race. You're seriously proposing that we kill 40 million civilians in order to win this war. So he was absolutely furious. So just know this is what the sort of things politically that were going on. He's fighting Vietnam against the Department of Defense, against the Joint Chief of Staff. The CIA is supporting a coup in South Vietnam because they're saying that he's not taking a hard enough
Mm-hmm.
stance on the communists. So this was DM and his brother New. So the CIA are supporting this. And what they did was they even said there was an explosion that happened at a protest. Basically, the Buddhists were protesting in South Vietnam, and they were protesting because DM said, I can't have all this religious segregation. So he put his foot down. He said, we need nationalism. So he was kind of ramping down on supporting people that were doing religious freedom. So what happened was at a Buddhist rally, a bomb went off and it killed a bunch of people. And there was actually a CIA officer that came forward and said, based on the type of bomb that was found, it was plastic explosives. This is a fingerprint at the time for the CIA, the type of explosives that were found at this bomb. So it was almost like a false flag type of incident to support a coup against DM and New and his brother. And effectively what happened was they were getting the people and the generals in South Vietnam to turn on the president at the time, who didn't want to take a hard stance and didn't want a all out
Mm-hmm.
war, and was trying to kind of have nationalism but not be dragged into an all out fight, which is what the CIA thought should be done. So he was also fighting. Understand that at the time Kennedy was fighting the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, the DoD, the CIA here in the United States on a secret level. DM and New, the president and vice president of South Vietnam, were also doing something similar against talk and plans to actually overthrow them with generals who were going to do a military coup in South Vietnam. So that was on May 8th of 1963. It was Captain Scott from the CIA who supported this, you know, supported this explosion where they found plastic explosives. And DM found out that this was done through the CIA. And he said, I want 50% of the United States troops out of here immediately. He was furious. He said, I do not want you in here. I don't want you in my country. And I don't want you meddling in my affairs. So he wanted them out. So um, moving forward, Kennedy's back here in the United States is dealing with what Eisenhower had warned for him to be aware of the military industrial complex. Kennedy's fighting major industries like steel. There was actually an article um, written called Steel, the Ides of April, almost like comparing Kennedy's stance against American steel for jacking the price of steel and effectively screwing the
Right.
American public because they were such a powerful industry. So Kennedy's just long and short of it, he's making a lot of enemies. He's standing up for like the common man. He's fighting against the thought of war. Um, the CIA file that I had mentioned before is a 201 file, and this was a known that Oswald had a 201 file against him. So this was like any member within the CIA that was being flagged for, being a security risk within the CIA. So um, just kind of moving forward, we kind of see the premise for Oswald being handled. Oswald maybe working
Yep.
with intelligence, Kennedy fighting the military-industrial complex and fighting against the CIA's plans to have a coup against him. There was an attempt made um, from men that were running operations for the CIA. Some of the men that were coming forward, let's see, some of the men that were coming forward was a man. There was a book written called "The Man Who Knew Too Much." And this was a story, a true story about Richard Case Nagel, who walked into a bank on September 20th, 1963, and fired 2 shots from a 45 into a wall, therefore winding himself getting a few years. I think it was like 4 or 5 years in federal
Right.
prison. And when he was arrested, he said, I would rather be arrested than commit treason or murder. The backstory on Nagel was that he was a double agent.
Huh.
He actually worked through the CIA for the KGB. And one of his jobs was to stop the plot that was well known at the time within the KGB that President Kennedy was going to be assassinated and it was going to be blamed on the KGB. It was going to be blamed on the Soviets. And this could be a premise to
Sure.
start a war. So the Soviets kind of got ahead of this plan, and they basically effectively hired Nigel to track down Oswald, who at the time was involved with a man named Angel and Leopoldo, who were two agents working for Alpha 66. These guys were, I think, another guy's name was Sergio Araca Smith, or I can get you the name Sergio Araca Smith. These were people that at the time were like handlers of Oswald. There were people that were dealing with him and basically setting him up. It almost seemed like they were setting him up to be a patsy. They were making him do this, whatever the CIA or whatever the intelligence communities had him doing was make it look like he was a communist. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, we have through records, through conversations with his wife, through books that he would withdraw from the library, that he actually admired Kennedy, Oswald. It seemed like he had a admiration, and he in some of his speeches, like a speech that he gave in August of 1963, he actually warned of a coup. He said in some of his speeches he warned that there could be a coup in the United
Hmm.
States. You know, it was at some college that he had a speech at. So um, effectively, Nagel found Oswald in New Orleans. This is the double agent through the KGB. And this is the man who fired the gun at the bank in Texas, who went to jail for 5 years. And he said that he was given orders through the KGB to make sure that Oswald knows he's being set up as a patsy. And if Oswald didn't want to interject in this plot, the KGB effectively said, you need to take care of Oswald. However, you have to do that. If you have to kill him, you have to kill him, but you cannot let him be involved in this plot. We don't want the KGB, we don't want the Soviet name being dragged into this mess, whatever this intelligence mess is. So effectively, what Nagel did was he sent a letter, and this is a fact, on September 17th to J. Edgar Hoover from the FBI, and he warned the FBI what was going on with the internal plot to kill
Hmm.
Kennedy. It was a certified letter that Nagel sent right before he walked into the bank. And Nagel said, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. If I kill Oswald, I'm basically killing an intelligence agency for the United States CIA, which makes me a bad guy. If I do nothing, I'm kind of now dragged into the
Right.
center of these circle of people that are looking to plot to kill the president. If I keep my mouth shut, I'm basically being compliant by keeping my mouth shut. So I'm damned if I do, if I'm damned if I kill Oswald and try to stop this thing, then I become the bad guy because publicly no one's going to admit any of this was going on. I'm just going to be some sort of a murderer if they catch me. And then if I do nothing, my name can get dragged into the fact that these guys went and are plotting to kill the president. So he said, my only way out is effectively, he was smart enough to know if I
Right.
walk into a
Sure.
bank and shoot a
Yeah.
firearm within a federal bank, I'm going to go to
No.
jail. And if I go to jail, I will be protected at least for 5 years. So he actually went to federal prison for 4 years, and he did send a letter to the FBI September 17th warning of this plot. So it was known. There were people that were working, like I said, a double agent,
Yeah.
and then kind of
I'm definitely going to look into that further. On that note, JP, my son is actually about to wake up from his nap. Is there any other specific question that I can answer for you? Otherwise, it sounds like you've given me a lot to think about, and I'm going
yeah,
to look into a couple of these books and look into certainly the Nigel case a bit further. But is there anything else that I could add? Otherwise, I think you are certainly well versed and can leave the audience with a tremendous amount of information and perspective.
yeah. So yeah. Other than that, I would just say, just on a whole, I would just say there is a lot had us come forward. And I mean, like, we even had so much, just to kind of wrap it up. We even had so much that there was a man who actually witnessed. He was deaf, and he was deaf and mute, and he witnessed the men standing behind the grassy
Mm.
knoll. We have a witness that came forward, and that witness effectively um, saw the people being dropped off. He saw the people moving around the grassy knoll. He saw that there was
Mm.
strangeness. He saw the puff of smoke that occurred on the hill, and he saw how a man wearing a suit threw a rifle to another man. So this man went to the FBI, and he actually attempted to tell his story, and he was offered $500 through the FBI to kind of just keep quiet about what he saw. You know, he had family that worked for law enforcement, and effectively, what happened was you had multiple witnesses that were basically witnesses to people that were known to be involved in killing President Kennedy that completely went against the Warren Commission. So the fact that we have so many witnesses
Right.
that came forward puts strong
Hmm.
doubt into the fact that his name was Ed Hoffman, the deaf
Gotcha.
witness. He actually went to the FBI and he was offered $500 from the FBI to keep his story shut. He saw a man on the grassy knoll shoot a rifle. He saw that man toss the rifle to a man wearing a railway conductor's uniform who broke the rifle down and stuffed it into a bag and ran off. And within like the first, I think it was Officer Smith, within the first 15 seconds of this officer running up the hill, drawing his pistol on the man wearing the suit, the man was able to produce credentials. And effectively, they were CIA credentials, and they found out afterwards there were no CIA agents. So, just to wrap it up,
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to wrap it up. You could
there's
keep going with the audience, but I'm going to get
yeah,
going just because I
there,
appreciate
there's
it. Um,
there's a strong evidence basically to state that these people were involved at some deeper level, and there was some sort of conspiracy fact going on, and there's enough witnesses to back up that there was much more
Understood.
going
Yeah,
on, and strongly
yeah. I mean,
to your
yeah.
suspicions. I certainly appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you
Thank
talking
you,
about all this
JP.
because it definitely,
Best of luck
yeah,
with
it definitely
best of luck with the podcast.
clears a lot of things up for me. And I certainly will continue listening to
Thank
your
you.
show. Thank you, Frank
Thanks a lot.
Morano, Other Side of Midnight, the Racket Report. I appreciate you coming on Not Media. Everybody, stay well. And
Thank
Frank,
you,
thanks
JP.
again for
Take
coming
care.
on. I
Bye
appreciate
bye.
you. Yeah, bye. Take it easy. Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you everyone who has chosen a life of service. This is not just military, fire, police, and EMS, but also anyone who has taken their talents and passions and used them for the service and betterment of others and this world. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying until next time. This is your host at Not Media, JP, signing off. Stay well, everyone.